Good evening, gentlemen. As I was just sharing with you, and I'll say it again for the stream, we are between chapter 9 and chapter 10 of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, good evening, of the second part of the Tanya. And we are having a rare, for us, a rare class without text, because the truth is that if you don't take a moment to, if you don't take a class to recapitulate, review, sort of take in, step back and take in the bigger picture of what we're doing, yes, we are going to not just get lost, but we are also going to, in a way, even more importantly, because being lost in Chassidus is not such a bad thing, but more importantly, we're going to miss out on some of the richness, some of the Reichkeit, as we would say in Yiddish, of what we're going to learn. In other words, if you really want to appreciate what the Alter Rebbe's, so to speak, grand conclusion is to Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, as we head into the last three chapters here, 10, 11, and 12, really you have to understand them as a result of the build-up of the first 9 chapters. In other words, chapter 1 through chapter 9, you have to understand almost as a big picture to kind of understand what the Alter Rebbe is doing, right? Because as I've said many times, and will continue to say, Mirta Hashem, the Alter Rebbe, when he writes something, he writes it with ultimate organization. There is no word out of place. There is no idea out of place. The entire Sefer, Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, all 12 chapters go in a procession exactly as the Alter Rebbe intended. And if you don't learn it carefully, and if you're not paying attention, you can totally miss what's going on. You know, the Alter Rebbe, sometimes it's so subtle, and you need to learn it so well, that when you study Tanya, and you may have this experience from Chitas, I do as well many times, learning the daily Tanya, that it just seems like an idea, and then another idea, and then another idea. It doesn't, you can't see the flow. The way the Alter Rebbe does the flow is in a way that's suiting minds like his. In other words, you have to be a little bit on the Alter Rebbe's level, or take the time to learn from people who are at least closer than you are, to sort of get what's the Alter Rebbe driving at, what is actually going on here, right? We can understand word by word, or even sentence by sentence, what the Alter Rebbe is saying, but to actually get why he is saying this, why is he saying this thing and now this thing and now this thing, is the key. It's not just a random conglomeration of theological ideas. It's not like the Alter Rebbe just threw together a bunch of different things he knew about Hashem into 12 chapters and they called it Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah. That is not the case. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Alter Rebbe has an agenda. The Alter Rebbe is driving at certain conclusions. He's driving to leave the Chassid who is studying, or the Jew in general, I should say, who is studying Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, in a certain place and with certain understandings. The Alter Rebbe, in other words, is an educator. And it's all b'kavana. The whole Sefer is organized b'kavana. So, with that in mind, there's only one question I have in how I want to proceed, which is I'll let you choose. We can either review what we did last week first and then step back and do sort of a broader thing, or we can start broader and then at the end we can connect it to what we did last week, and then you should think the second one we should do. Let's start broad, good idea, because then once we get into the specifics, that will be fresher on our mind for when we go into the immediate next thing, which is chapter 10. So let's start broad. What is this book about, Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, right? Setting aside for a minute the very important idea which is brought in Chinuch Katan, which is the very introduction to the Sefer, right? Where the Alter Rebbe essentially says that this is a book about education. It's to teach us how, it's to give a Jew the tools to produce love and fear of Hashem in his own heart. Right, as we spoke about all the way back at the beginning of this book in Chinuch Katan, which means the education of a child, is the name of the introduction to this work, right? And this is in keeping, in general, as we explained when we learned that part, with the Alter Rebbe's general project, with Chassidus Chabad in general. In general, the idea of Chassidus Chabad is the different, or we could say the difference between Chassidus Chabad and other forms of Chassidus, other students of the Baal Shem Tov, aside from the Alter Rebbe, is that the Alter Rebbe's goal for his followers is not that they should attach themselves to a Rebbe and thereby get in touch with their own souls. It is rather a much more, ambitious, some might say even absurd project, which is that every chassid of the Rebbe should themselves almost be a Rebbe in themselves. In other words, it is a project not for making chassidim in the general sense, almost it's a project for making rebbeim. What do I mean by that? Because obviously no chassid is comparable to their Rebbe, right? So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that if the idea of Chassidus is to arouse the soul to a certain relationship with Hashem, right? That arousing of the soul, that touching of the soul, can either come externally from a Rebbe, from a teacher, from a holy tzaddik who you connect yourself to, or it can come internally, right? It can come from yourself. And the idea of Chassidus Chabad, in a nutshell, is that by using your seichel, by using your mind, which is why it's called Chabad, you are able to arouse within yourself and to arouse your soul, so to speak, on your own power, on your own, with your own keiches, with your own faculties. Don't use the Rebbe to arouse your soul. Use your mind to arouse your soul, right? And of course, but what do we use in our mind? We use it from the Rebbe, so it's not so simple, right? It's still the Rebbe, but how does the Rebbe do it? In a distancing action, not directly, but rather by teaching you so you can do it to yourself.
It's like triggering.
Yeah, it's a sort of form of empowerment, right? It's really the deeper concept it's the deeper concept underlying the famous slogan that Rabbi Sachs always says, that the Rebbe didn't make followers, he made leaders, right? The truth is that if Rabbi Sachs were a Chabad Chassid of previous generations, he would have said the same idea. In other words, the truth is that what he saw in the Rebbe is really an institutional idea in Chabad from the Alter Rebbe. It's not the Rebbe's innovation. True, the Rebbe did it in a different way and at a different extent and maybe at a different scale than previous Rebbes. But the truth is really, this is part of the entire approach of Chabad. The entire approach of Chabad is that you can arouse your own love and fear. How do you do that? You do that by contemplating God. You, in your understanding, right? Because, why does it have to be through the mind? Really, no matter which approach you have, whether it's a Chabad approach or a non-Chabad approach, you have to deal with the mind. The question is the mind to be pushed aside? In other words, do we circumvent the mind or do we transform the mind? Which is another way of stating the difference. Chassidus Chabad aims to transform the mind. In fact, Chassidus Chabad says that if the mind is not transformed, you have not yet reached Tachlis HaKavona. In other words, the ultimate goal, the ultimate purpose, the ultimate battlefield, the reason you were given a mind is to transform it and make it into a godly mind. As opposed to other approaches which say that the mind merely gets in the way. The mind is what stands between, so to speak, your false perception, right? Your conscious perception of reality stands in between you and the truth. Your soul knows that God is all there is, right? And God knows that God is all there is. The only thing standing in the way is your mind.
But they're both right.
Of course they're both right, but the thing is what do we do about it, really? They both make the same assessment. Everybody agrees the mind is in the way. Everybody agrees the mind is in the way. The question is, what do we do about it?
Well,
the
second
Chabad
solution has nothing to do. No, the first one has something to do. The Chabad way is actually pushing the mind to understand what it's missing.
Yeah, no, it's to educate the mind, is really what it is about.
Right.
The other approach says that the mind can be circumvented because the mind is not the battlefield. The mind only gets in the way. You understand the difference? In other words, it's not the mind, we don't need the mind. The question is do we need the mind for our service of Hashem to be complete? The Chabad approach would say yes. The non-Chabad approach would say the mind can follow, the mind can be a consequence, but to say the mind itself is inherently important, not necessarily.
But the mind is controlling you, so if you're not changing...
No, it's not necessarily controlling you, it's just in the way, right? So when something is in the way, there's different ways of looking at it.
Who is getting you to shul?
Sorry?
How do you get to shul? What is like pushing you to go to shul?
Yeah, your neshama, which is not your mind.
But they're not talking about the neshama at all?
Who isn't?
I mean, both of the systems.
Both of the systems are talking about the neshama. In fact, both of the systems, all they're talking about is the neshama. The neshama is the key. You have the neshama. Revealing the neshama, or what we call emunah, is the entire approach of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov says that a Jew at his essence knows God. Chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov, right? You don't need to learn the Torah or learn Gemara or be a big Talmid Chacham or be this or that to know God. You know God already. It's who you are. Chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov.
So what is the difference between the neshama and the soul?
The neshama is the soul.
The neshama and the mind.
And the mind, very different, because the neshama knows God how? Not in a way of seichel. It knows God directly. By being a chelek of Hashem, it knows Hashem.
But the mind is aware of the neshama?
Either it is or it isn't, right? That's the thing. Some more, some less. So the question is, what do we do about the mind?
I might respond, be careful.
Good evening. Some approaches say circumvent it. Other approaches say use it. Really, this is tangential to our discussion. So since the approach of Chassidus Chabad is to use the mind, the Alter Rebbe writes a part of Tanya called Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, the book we're learning. And the whole purpose of the book is that he will give you truths, he will give you things to contemplate, he will give you things to educate your mind with, and if you contemplate this enough and really bring it into your understanding and make it part of your reality, the mind becomes transparent, and on the contrary, it helps you in the service of Hashem, and you are able to generate from within yourself, not because the soul perceives some truth beyond itself and your metzias, your being, retreats and you are able to be one with Hashem, not in a way purely of emunah, right? But you, even participating, even involving your metzias, even involving what you are as a yesh, which is really the distinction between mind and soul, which is that one is yesh and one is ayin. One perceives itself as an independent being, one perceives itself as a part of Hashem, is really the fundamental difference. So the approach of Chabad is that even as something, right, what can that something be? That something can be nothing. How do you teach a something to be nothing with Chassidus? That's the answer of the Alter Rebbe. How do we come to a love and fear of Hashem? We come to a love and fear of Hashem by contemplating Him with our very mind, with the same mind that thinks about business and food and science, right, and all these other things we can think about. That same mind can become totally transparent, totally transformed into a tool that can bring about midos, that can bring about love and fear of Hashem. That's what Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah is. Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah is what you need to think about to connect your soul to Hashem in the Alter Rebbe's way. But even putting aside all that, right? In other words, that's the purpose of the book. That's why we study the book and what the book is written for. But what is the book about? The book itself, right? Not what it's for, but in what it says, right? Within these concepts that we are learning to arouse our love and fear, what is the central concept? What is the theme of this book? Unity of Hashem. Very good. What's a different way of saying unity of Hashem? It's a pasuk. It's a very famous pasuk at the beginning of our book. Oh, there's actually a few pasukim, right? We say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, Baruch Shein Kavod Malchus Lo Olam Vad. This is the higher unity and the lower unity. But there's an even simpler pasuk. There's an even simpler. What? Atah Echad V'Shimcha Echad, but that's not at the beginning of our book. What's the pasuk at the beginning of our book? No, that's not at the beginning. Ata Harei Saladas. Yeah.
But that's like, why? How does that show the unity?
Ein Eid Milvade is really that's the key words here, right? Ein Eid or Ein Eid Milvade, depending which pasuk, right? Ein Eid, there is nothing other than Him. What does that mean? Ein Eid, there is nothing other than Him. Good evening, good evening. Please join us if you want. What does that mean? Ein Eid, that there is nothing other than Him. How do you interpret those words? Right? How do you interpret Ein Oid, that there is nothing other than him?
There's only one of him, or he is everything, and there's nothing else.
So if those are the two, then there's more than two. Okay, there's a few. There's a handful. There's a handful. There's a handful. The simplest reading of Ein Oid, that there is nothing other than him, is that there is no God other than God. Right? That's the simplest meaning. The truth is that even this simplest meaning, and we're not going to go into it now, but even this simplest meaning is a kli, is a vessel for the deeper meanings. In other words, if you really, really dig into that there's only one God and there's no other God, you would actually arrive, most likely, at all the other conclusions as well. If you take it to the furthest extent. In other words, if you really understood what those words mean, it means a lot more than what it seems to say, right? It seems to just say, okay, there's this God and there's no other gods. Very simple, very straightforward, right? And then you start asking, what's a God? What's another, right? All the different, defining the words, it starts to get deeper.
But in these days, and I think even the time that Alter Rebbe was living, people did believe in one God.
It's the Alter Rebbe's question, right? The Alter Rebbe's question at the beginning of the Sefer is, do people really... Well, the Alter Rebbe asked it in a slightly different way. The Alter Rebbe says, does it really need to say V'hashevesa alav avecha about this concept? Take it to heart, right? Who believes deep in their heart that there's a God under the sea? Right? In other words, the Alter Rebbe basically asked Eyal's question, is, why is the Torah so emphatic? Who has this deep-seated, emotional need to believe that there's other gods? Which is why the Alter Rebbe says really it means something deeper. It means, Ein Oid means that there is nothing that exists other than him. In which case we do have an intense emotional attachment to the idea that something other than him exists. In fact, you might say it's our only natural emotional attachment. In other words, our fundamental emotional attachment is to our own existence. You could say it's almost what the word emotion means. Right? It means what things matter to me, right? Emotion places me at the center in general, almost by definition. So our fundamental emotional need, right? The basis of all emotion is my own existence, right? Then that's why you have to Vashevesa alav avecha. Hashem commands us to take it to heart that only He exists. This idea is the idea of the first 7 chapters of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. The first 7 chapters discuss the idea that only God exists. Now, of course, what's the classic beginner's mistake? The classic beginner's mistake is only God exists, very simple, nothing else is, right? Everything else is only an illusion, right? We leap immediately to the radical and easy conclusion. Everything else is only an illusion, nothing else is really here, right? So why, if it's so simple, why does the Alter Rebbe have 7 very, very complex chapters on it? And the answer is that it's not so simple, right? First of all, as Rabbi Yoel is fond of saying, what's the proof that the world actually does exist? It's a famous pasuk. Which pasuk? Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'es haaretz. First pasuk of the Torah, right? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Torah's emes, the Torah of truth, tells us God created a world. That's the clearest proof. The clearest proof that there is a world, that there is something other than Hashem, is the Torah says it right at the beginning, right? Classic proof. So what do we mean when we say that nothing other than Hashem exists? What then do we mean when we say Ein Oid? And the Alter Rebbe begins to explain. First, he explains it in the first chapter in a way of emunah, right? Which again, the way of Chabad is not purely intellectual. Remember, it's the emunah coming into the intellect. It's faith coming into the mind, as we said before. So the first chapter doesn't bring us any intellectual or philosophical explanations. It quotes a midrash and it quotes the Baal Shem Tov, and it says what? It says that when the Torah says Le'olam dvarcha Hashem nitzav b'shamayim, when it says, forever Hashem, your words stand in the heavens, this refers to the words Yehi Rakia that it says in Parshas Bereshis. That when God says, let there be a firmament, let there be a firmament, let there be a Rakia, those words are constantly creating the heavens. Right? That Hashem never stops speaking, never stops speaking. Those words never cease to be spoken. From this we conclude that what is everything that exists since the 6 days of creation? Everything is the constant speech of Hashem. That's what we say right in the first chapter, right? What is everything? Everything is just an expression of Hashem, and that's what we mean when we say that there is nothing other than Him, right? We mean that since there is just Him and His expression and the words He speaks, right? And nothing ever attains any independence from Him, right? Therefore, all that exists is Him. In the second chapter, we explain this philosophically, right? We explain how because He creates everything something from nothing, right? And creation something from nothing is not like creating something from something, where we only bring out the potential in the thing, right? You may remember from many centuries ago our discussion of the block of silver, right? And you make it into a cup, or you make it into a menorah. And then you can go walking in the shuk, and the vessel still sits there exactly as it is. And we explained how that's only possible because the potential to be a cup already exists in the block of silver. And all you're doing is actualizing that potential. And therefore, just as the block of silver existed without you, so can the cup exist without you being there right now, right? But creation, something from nothing, is not like that at all, because it's not the actualization of a potential. There is no potential for anything to exist. And therefore, when He brings it into existence, right, it is totally dependent on Him at every moment. There is no prior existence on which it may depend, because it's created from absolute nothingness, right? And that whole discussion, I'm going through this very quickly and very broadly. It's mostly just to, so to speak, remind you. It's just to arouse your memory, to inspire your memory. And then, when we get to chapter 3, is really where we bring it to its higher state, right? We say that not only, because chapter 2 says that what is the world? Nothing other than the speech of Hashem, right? The world is totally dependent on the speech of Hashem at every moment. Chapter 3, we go even further. We say that if He is speaking it into existence at every moment, then what is it really? Nothing other than that speech, right? So chapter 2 says that the world depends on God at every moment. Chapter 3 says that if it truly depends on Him at every moment and is utterly dependent on Him, then what is it, even when it exists? Nothing other than Hashem. It is nothing other than its source in godliness, right? The famous metaphor for this that we bring is the metaphor of the ray of the sun in the sun, right? Ziv Hashemesh B'seich Kadur Hashemesh, right? The ray of the sun within the actual body of the sun. Who remembers what we explained in that metaphor? What does the ray of the sun in the sun mean?
The ray in the sun?
Yeah, the ray of the sun in the sun.
Inside the sun it's bottle, and outside it has some kind of manifestation.
That's true. So what does that mean? Go on.
Hello.
What does it mean it's bottle, first of all? What does that word mean for our non-Hebrew speakers?
It does not manifest itself outside the sun in any way.
No, we're talking about inside the sun, I thought. What does the word bottle mean? No? Translation?
Non-existent.
Yeah, we would say nullified, but you're right. Nullified is a fancy way of saying it doesn't exist. It isn't.
Yeah, it's like you talk about the ocean, a drop in the ocean. Still, you have the ocean. Don't say the drop.
Bottle, right? Bottle means it doesn't exist. Although it means it doesn't exist in a very specific way. It doesn't exist as part of something else, right? It becomes nothing within a greater something.
You cannot define it.
Right? The ray of the sun in the sun. As we explained in that chapter, the ray of the sun in the sun is a metaphor. What are you meant to conclude from that metaphor? You're meant to conclude, what do I have what is the ray of light when it's still in its source? When it's in the sun, there actually is no ray of light, right? There's just the sun. It's the sun shining, right? There is no actual ray of light within the body of the sun, neither physically nor in our mashal. right? There is no actual ray of sun there. However, the ray of sun, on the other hand, must be there, because if it's outside of the sun, surely it exists within the sun as well, because the sun is its only source. So you must conclude that the ray of the sun is there, but in what state is it there? Completely part of the sun. All there is really is the sun in that source, right? So this is what the world is within the word of Hashem. The universe within the universe of Hashem, within the word of Hashem, is like the ray of the sun within the sun. It has no independent reality whatsoever. All that is here, when we look at anything in the physical universe, when we look at this table, all this table is a ray of the sun in the sun. It is the word of Hashem. That's all that's here. Chapters 4 through 6 deal with this very simple question, which is, if that's the case, why does it not seem that way? Right? Why does it not look like godliness? Why does it look like a table that has nothing to do with godliness, right? And there's different answers to this question. Our answers become quite involved, right? We have the idea of a tzimtzum. God conceals himself from us, right? And the very way that the word of Hashem is revealed, it is revealed in a way of concealment, as we explained at length. There is the light in the vessel, right? All these different concepts, extremely involved, extremely complex explanations. And in chapter 7, we explain this idea in the concept of the higher level unity and the lower level unity, Yichud Eilah, Yichud Tata, and how essentially the universe is nothing within the word of Hashem, and the word of Hashem is itself nothing within its source as well, right? So all there really is Hashem and his expression, and how from his perspective the creation of the universe has not changed anything. That's where we said, Ani Havaya Lo Shanisi, I Hashem have not changed, right? He hasn't changed. His knowledge hasn't changed. Nothing has changed. And therefore, may I borrow someone's watch, please? I just need a sense of the time here. Anybody have a watch I can borrow?
8:05.
What time is it? 8:06.
Oh, you have somewhere I can just put here so I can keep an eye on it? I have to learn how to pace myself. Thank you very much. Thank you, I appreciate it. So when my phone's recording, I don't have time on it. Thank you.
I guess he didn't ask for the time. It's for what? It's manifestation.
So in this sense, the first 7 chapters are all about Ein Od. There is nothing other than him, right? However, in chapter 8, really at the end of chapter 7, going into chapter 8, things become more complicated again. Because Ein Od really means something else as well. And in fact, it means the exact opposite of what it means in the first 7 chapters. In the first 7 chapters, Ein Od means that everything other than Hashem is nothing. Starting at the end of chapter 7, and in chapter 8, and in chapter 9, the Alter Rebbe is saying Ein Od in the exact opposite sense. Not that everything other than Hashem is nothing, but that everything other than Hashem is only an expression of Hashem. Not that everything other than Hashem is nothing, but that everything other than Hashem is an expression of Hashem. Why is it the opposite of being nothing, to be an expression of Hashem? The question answers itself almost, right? Why is being an expression of Hashem the opposite of being nothing?
Because it's something.
Because Hashem is not just a something, he is the something.
That's right. I mean, the question is not even relevant. Because if God is everything...
Yeah, self-answering question, really, right? To be an expression of Hashem is not to be nothing. It is to be, on the contrary, the greatest something, right? The greatest something, the greatest thing there is. You are an expression of what we call in Chassidus the Yesh HaAmiti, the only true something, right? The only true something is Hashem himself. To be an expression of Hashem himself is to be pretty much the greatest something you can be without being God himself. Yeah? So the Alter Rebbe, really, and the truth is that it's good that we didn't bring this up earlier because it would probably just have confused us up until this point. This is the latest you can actually leave this idea in the study of Tanya because you can't understand chapter 10 without it. But the Alter Rebbe is explaining essentially two opposite readings of the idea of Ein Od. Until chapter 7, we are explaining how everything is batel, how everything is nothing. After chapter 7, we are explaining how everything is one, the opposite of batel. Everything is one with Hashem, which means everything is something, not everything is nothing, right? This is expressed in a famous saying of the Frierdiker Rebbe, where he said, "Alts is elokus and elokus is alts," which means everything is godliness and godliness is everything, right? Which are actually, in a sense, two opposite statements, right? Everything is godly and everything is godliness and godliness is everything. In other words, either all there is Hashem, in which case everything else is zero, or Hashem is everything, in which case everything is not reduced to nothing, everything is elevated to be an expression of Him. Right? So these are two different ways to read Ein Od. Either there is nothing other than Hashem, in the sense of everything else is nothing, or there is nothing other than Hashem in the sense of everything is an expression of Him. Right? And these two ideas correspond to two different, how should we put it? Two different principles of Jewish faith. The first is called, the first could be, it's really, the first could be called Hashem's Achdus, and the second could be called Hashem's Pshitus. The first is the idea that Hashem is one and there is nothing else. The second is the idea that Hashem is simple, which means, what do we mean by Hashem is simple? We mean that all of His traits, right? His wisdom, His kindness, His will, all of His traits are absolutely one with Him, right? From the idea that all of His traits are one with Him, you arrive at the idea that everything is an expression of Hashem. The second concept within Ein Od, right? The second idea of Ein Od is connected with the idea that Hashem is absolutely simple. He's simple. He has no parts, right? The idea that nothing exists other than Hashem is a different prat. It's a different detail in His unity. It's not focusing on His simplicity. It's focusing on His oneness, so to speak. His uniqueness. But how can you say that God has no parts? I understand that He is one, but even one can contain parts. Yeah, but Hashem is a one that does not contain parts. That's the whole idea. Generally speaking, as we saw, it's fine. It's a fair question. Let's talk about it for a minute. We've spoken about it in this class before from a philosophical angle, right? The fact is that as a philosophical exploration, if you're looking for something that's Hashem, if you arrive at something that can possibly have parts, it's not Hashem that you've arrived at. Why? Think about it in terms of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu is really the original philosopher of Judaism. Before Hashem revealed Himself to him at Parshas Lech Lecha, and then he became the original prophet of Judaism, separate idea, right? And the Rebbe has a beautiful sikha explaining how the reason why Avram as a philosopher does not appear in the Chumash, and really the first thing we learn about him is Hashem speaking to him in Parshas Lech Lecha, is because the whole idea of a Jew is that even if you have an entire philosophy of Hashem, you're willing to set it aside for what Hashem tells you in His revelation, what Hashem tells you in His Torah, and really that's what's uniquely Jewish. What's uniquely Jewish is that Avram spent decades and decades of his life pursuing Hashem as an idea, and the moment Hashem revealed Himself to Avram was willing to throw all those ideas out the window and do exactly what Hashem told him. And that's really what made him Jewish. That's what made him special and the first Jew, not his deep philosophical exploration. But even though we don't have it in the Chumash, the Midrash fills in the backstory, right? The Midrash tells us the whole story of Avram. And you have many stories. You have him smashing his father's shop, which is very important, right? These are fundamental stories to Judaism. If you don't understand these stories, if you don't know these midrashim, you're missing the whole story. The whole story of the first Jew you're missing. If you don't have these stories, I recommend finding your nearest little midrash says and reading them. So that's how I learn them. It's the best, got to be the best way to learn them. There's another story of Avram. There's Avram getting thrown in the furnace, right, which is directly connected to the smashing of the idols. You can read that whole story. And there's the story of how Avram concluded in the first place that Hashem is Hashem, that there is one God who must be served, right? Because this whole idea was lost to Avram. Avram grew up in a house of idolators. He was not taught as a child that there is one God. So how did he come to this conclusion? The answer is that he was a philosopher. He came to this conclusion by looking at the world around him. Right. And the Midrash explains very simply, and really, in a sense, this is all a Jew needs to know of ancient philosophy is really contained within this Midrash. The Midrash is very simple. Avram looked at, I wish I remembered the details by heart, but Avram looked at a bunch of different things. For example, he looked at the sun. Right? He said, the sun is the source of all life on earth, right? All plants depend on the sun, all animals depend on the sun, everything depends on the sun. The sun must be what is worthy of worship. But then he saw that part of the time the sun is not here. The sun is not influencing the earth part of the time. Part of the time the sun goes away. It sets, right, and the moon rises. So then he thinks, well, maybe it's all about the moon. But then he sees that the moon depends on the sun, right? So he says, okay, maybe it's not the sun and the moon, but I see the clouds are sometimes cover up the sun. So in a way, the clouds are more powerful than the sun on earth. So maybe I should worship the clouds. But then he sees that the wind blows the clouds away. He says, so maybe I should worship the wind. But then he sees that the wind can't move the mountain. So maybe he should worship the mountain, right? But then he sees that the water wears away the mountain. So maybe he should worship the water, right? And then he sees and so on and so on and so on, right? What does he eventually conclude? He eventually concludes that all of these things change. All of these things have only a partial power, right? They cannot possibly be the source of everything because their power is only partial. They all have things which are more powerful than them. He concluded that there must be one original source that never changes, right? That has no concept of changing, of coming into being and then passing or growing or lessening, passing or growing or lessening or decreasing or increasing over time. There must be a constant source of everything. And that's essentially how Avram arrived at the idea of Hashem. From this midrash, we can answer Eyal's question. From this midrash, we answer the question of how do we know Hashem is simple and he doesn't have parts? And the answer is because if Hashem has parts, then he's like the sun or the mountain or the wind, right? The reason why all of those things change, right, if you think about it, the reason why change is possible is because they have parts, right? Because the whole idea that the sun can be here, but its expression can be cut off, right, means that there is the sun and its expression. There's the sun and the rays of the sun, right? Or so too with the wind, right? The wind moves from one place to another, which means that it has a potential which is actualized. It has the ability to be in the west, but now it's in the east, which means that it has parts. It has an aspect of where it is, and it has the aspect of where it is able to be, right? At least two parts, right? Mm-hmm. So everything that changes, Avram would have realized, right? Everything that changes, the change is because of parts. There is an actual aspect and a potential aspect, right? There's what it's doing and what it has the ability to do. There's what it is and what it has the ability to be, right? And having an ability that is unfulfilled, right? Having a potential that is not actual is a sign of imperfection. And it is that imperfection which allows all those other things to control it, right? Why is it that the wind cannot move the mountain, right? Because the wind only has a certain amount of power. The wind only has the potential to be in one place. It doesn't have the potential to be where the mountain is. It's lacking that ability, right? The mountain can stop the wind, right? It's because, in other words, if you think about it more deeply, it's because the wind has parts that it's not able to be where the mountain is, right? Why is Hashem able to be everywhere? Because he has no parts. There is no potential that is unactualized. He is pure, he is what he is, with no parts and no aspects, right? So in other words, we learn even from Avram, even just from that midrash, contains the idea that Hashem by definition must not have parts, right? And that's why one of the 13 principles of faith in Yiddishkeit, right, the Rambam codifies as one of the things that Jews believe is that Hashem doesn't have a body nor the form of a body, right? Because by definition, that's what Hashem is. Hashem is...
But when it says that God spoke,
yeah.
So...
No, it's a separate... No, it's a separate... That's a good question on which there are zillions of pages of Torah, but that's really a separate question. In other words, that's already trying to... That's a question about how can that be true given the idea that God is simple. Can we at least agree that God must be simple? And then how he is simple is a separate question, right? That's what the Alter Rebbe is speaking to in these chapters of Shaar HaYichud Ve'emunah. What? Bidmutov Etzalmo, also a question. Yeah, Tselem Elokim, fair question. How can there be a form of God? And we say man is created in the image of God if Hashem doesn't have an image or a body, right? Another classic question. But the thing is that these are all questions, so to speak, following the acceptance of Hashem's simplicity. They're questions that say, given Hashem's simplicity, how can X, Y, Z be true? The only point I was trying to make is that we see where this principle arises. This principle is fundamental, right? It goes all the way back to Avram. Now, it is these sorts of questions that chapters 8 through 10 of Shaar HaYichud Ve'emunah are dealing with. We are discussing Hashem's simplicity. And we essentially say like this. We say like this because the Alter Rebbe really introduces a very different idea of Hashem's simplicity than existed in Judaism, or that was explicit in Judaism before the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe has a incredibly deep understanding of Hashem's simplicity that includes many other opinions within Judaism. It has as part of it even people who argued with each other, like the Maharal and the Rambam, as we've discussed in this class multiple times. Right, their opinions are both included within the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe is able to turn to both of these sages and say, you're both right, which is part of the greatness of the Alter Rebbe's approach. The Alter Rebbe in these chapters, I'm going to summarize these chapters briefly, and then next week in Mirz Hashem we'll start chapter 10. The brief summary is as follows. The Alter Rebbe asks, how can Hashem be a being of wisdom? Essentially asking Eyal's question, right, about the outstretched arm, or Hashem being wise, is really the ultimate version of the question, but it's all the same, right? Asking about ascribing traits or ascribing certain qualities to Hashem. And the Alter Rebbe asks the question, how can Hashem be a being of wisdom, right, if Hashem is infinitely removed from wisdom? The Torah calls Hashem wise. It says he's a chacham. But how can that be true if Hashem is infinitely above wisdom and Hashem is not a mental phenomenon, right? As the Alter Rebbe explains, God is so far above being understandable that you can't even say about him, I don't understand him. Because saying I don't understand him implies that he's something which can in theory be understood, and I don't understand, right? God is not something which in theory can be understood, because God is not a mental phenomenon. Just as an idea cannot be touched with your hands because it's not physical, so God cannot be understood by your mind. He's not mental. He's not a mental phenomenon. He is not an idea. He is not within the realm of understanding. How then can the Torah say that Hashem is wise? That is, Hashem essentially has a mind, that he exists within the realm of the mental? The answer is that he expresses himself in wisdom. He has something called wisdom, he has something called chachma, and the chachma is an expression of him, an emanation, and is netzal v'nimshach, right, were our terms. Hashem's wisdom is emanated and drawn forth from him. In other words, he is expressed in wisdom, and wisdom expresses him. even though he is infinitely above wisdom. Both of these things are true, the Alter Rebbe says. On the one hand, he is infinitely above wisdom, right? Wisdom cannot possibly contain him. On the other hand, he expresses himself in wisdom, his wisdom expresses him. And the Alter Rebbe concludes, really, that therefore there's actually, in a sense, there's two different things here. There's Hashem, and there's his emanated wisdom, right? Before Hashem contracts himself and emanates his wisdom, he's not even within the realm of understanding, to the extent to say that you can't understand him. He's beyond even saying, I don't understand him. When he contracts himself and limits himself and emanates his wisdom, that is the level about which the Rambam says we don't understand him, right? Or a different way of saying this is, he, the knower, the knowledge, and the known, he, his wisdom, and the object of his wisdom are all absolutely one, right? Or he knows by knowing himself. All of these things are the same, right? They're all describing the same phenomenon, which is that God is his wisdom. Where is that true? In the emanation, that God is his wisdom. Yes?
So how do we get how his wisdom is accessible to us, if at all?
His wisdom is not accessible to us. Actually, that's the next thing on the
part of
doc.
it, yes.
No, not as the Alter Rebbe is saying.
The Torah is that part.
Yeah, the Alter Rebbe is saying that Hashem and his wisdom are absolutely one. Can you understand Hashem?
No.
It's ridiculous to even ask the question.
It's a sin even to ask the question.
It's ridiculous to even ask the question, right?
Yet,
So,
he gave us the Torah.
So, his wisdom, which is absolutely one with him, is exactly the same, right? His wisdom, which is absolutely one with him, is exactly the same. Therefore, you have to conclude, do you understand the Torah? In fact, is it even right to say, I don't understand the Torah? Is really the question.
Something you cannot say it? No?
The Torah is absolutely one with him, right? It's not even right to say, I don't understand the Torah. The Torah is not a mental phenomenon. It comes into our minds. It comes into our minds. It comes down into our wisdom. You can read it. You can study it in a book, etc., etc. Okay, fair enough. No. In other words, there's clearly other steps to this process. But the thing is, that actually what you are meant to conclude is the opposite. You're not meant to conclude that what the Alter Rebbe is saying here is qualified and that the Torah eventually does become wisdom. You're meant to conclude the opposite. You're meant to conclude that what appears to be wisdom and what appears to be Torah that I'm understanding, right, what is it at essence? It's not understandable, right? It's godliness, not wisdom. That's meant to be the conclusion. The conclusion is meant to be that the fact that Torah appears like wisdom is very similar to the way that God's expression appears to be a table.
I disagree.
Why?
Because if God made the Torah for us to understand, we can understand the Torah. He didn't write the Torah for himself so we don't understand, or we cannot understand because we are far away from him. He made it specifically in a way that we will understand.
We know who Groucho Marx is?
No?
You don't know who Groucho Marx is? Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx. No, Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx is my favorite type of Marxism. It's the only type of Marxism I ascribe to. It's Groucho Marxism. Groucho Marx, famous Jewish comedian, right, from the Marx brothers. Groucho Marx was a deep philosopher. The deepest philosophical statement of Groucho Marx is when he said that he wouldn't want to be part of any club that would have him as a member.
Yeah.
Right? The deepest statement of Groucho Marx, right? Yeah. So the same principle applies. So do you really want a Torah, right, that is a Torah that would have you understanding it, right? Is that the Torah that you want?
It's not a fair question.
Why not?
Because if that one that he know that you don't understand, and you're not even close to him, but he gave you a gift for you to understand, then it's a different story.
The thing is, the question is, what's the nature of the gift? In other words, everyone agrees the Torah was given to the Bnei Yisrael. Everyone agrees that you're supposed to use your mind to try and understand the Torah. The question is what does it mean to use your mind to understand the Torah? In other words, this is really, really for its own whole hour-long class. Really it is. But the answer on one foot is that the apparent existence of Torah as seichel, the apparent existence of Torah as something to be understood, is really, really not real. It's not real. The Torah as something to be understood intellectually is simply a vessel for what the Torah really is. That's the bottom line. The bottom line is, it's very simple to, I'll tell you the exact same idea in a different concept, and you'll see how you already understand this. You already understand this, right? Why do we say, when Hashem says that you have to go to a job and work, right? What do we mean? What does that mean? Why do you have to work? Right? What Eyal is saying is that God tells you that you have to work, right? It's Adam is told in Gan Eden that he has to work the land, and by the sweat of his brow he shall live, right? Man has to work. So what Eyal is saying is that when Hashem says man has to work, it means that Hashem literally just wants man to work. That's essentially what you're saying, right? Comes Chassidus and says that the entire nature of man working is simply because God desired a vessel within nature for his blessings to come to man. Right? In other words, the work is not an end unto itself. And not only is it not an end unto itself, it has no existence unto itself. We work as an expression of Hashem's will. We don't work to work. Right? The only reason we go to work is because Hashem wanted that his blessing should come to us through work. But work as its own thing, as an end unto itself, right, has no existence. Similarly, exactly the same is Hashem gave us the Torah to understand. Exact same idea. Exact same idea. Did Hashem give us the Torah to understand with our understanding as an end unto itself? Comes the Alter Rebbe and he says, on the contrary, the understanding aspect of Torah is merely an expression of the Torah's true nature. The only reason we understand Torah intellectually is because God desired that the totally non-understandable, godly nature of his wisdom, right, should be brought even into something so separate from him as understanding. But the understanding is not an end unto itself and has no existence of its own. The understanding is totally dependent on Hashem's will, which comes from a place beyond understanding. That's the answer on one foot. The answer on one foot, the conclusion a Jew is supposed to draw from what we learn in Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah about Hashem's wisdom is not that, but the Torah eventually comes into wisdom. That's like saying the conclusion you draw from Chassidus about the blessing of Hashem is, but at the end of the day you have to work, right? That's called missing the entire point. The entire point is that what is your work? Your work itself is just an expression of godliness. It's not real. Right? All it is an expression of him. It has no independent reality. So too, you're supposed to conclude about Hashem's wisdom and about the Torah. What is his wisdom? All it is an expression of godliness. What is the understanding of the Torah, the study of the Torah intellectually? All it is an expression of godliness which is not intellectual at a lower place. That's the answer to that question on one foot.
Which means if we understood the Torah, what exactly we understood?
It depends what you mean by understanding, right? I should have said that at the beginning as well, right? In other words,
7 different ways.
Yeah, when we say understanding here, what we mean is intellectual understanding, understanding with your mind, understanding with reason, right? Not that that's something that's not part of Torah, right? That's what the whole Gemara is, and to some extent, right? You're learning and understanding with your reason. So, we conclude chapter 9. Chapter 9 concludes with the following idea, which we touched on last week and we'll touch again on this week, which is that he and his wisdom are one, not just on his terms, but on his wisdom's terms as well. He and his wisdom are one, not just on his terms, but on his wisdom terms, which means what exactly? It really connects to Eyal's question. His wisdom itself expresses that he cannot be expressed in wisdom. That's what that means. His wisdom itself expresses that he cannot be expressed in wisdom. A different way of saying this, although it won't make it any easier to understand, but a different way of saying this is, because he can't be expressed in wisdom, right? His wisdom, by expressing this fact, expresses him. Because he cannot be expressed in wisdom, right? And this is what I said last week, and it got some people hot and bothered. Because he cannot be expressed in wisdom, right? his wisdom expresses this idea that he cannot be expressed in wisdom, and therefore it expresses him. Right? What does it express of him? It expresses the idea that he cannot be expressed in wisdom. Right? We don't need to dwell on this too much. Right? We don't need to dwell on this too much. The main reason to point out this idea is to realize that the two aspects of his wisdom, that it's on the one hand emanated, but on the one hand infinitely far away from him, these two ideas are really self-supporting. They seem to be opposites, but in some strange way, they actually reinforce each other. The idea that his wisdom expresses him, and on the other hand, that he's infinitely above wisdom. Because, in other words, it's because they have nothing in common that they're actually absolutely one. Right? That's the paradox, right? Remember, this is what the Alter Rebbe says about this, that you can't understand it. This is what we have faith. This is emunah. This is why the spheres, like his wisdom, are called raza de mehem nusa. They're called the secret of faith, right? Because you cannot comprehend this. It's a contradiction. It's a paradox, right? It is because he is infinitely removed from wisdom that his wisdom expresses him. Or, to put it better, that they are one. It is because they are totally separate that they are actually one.
But I have a question about that, because we talk about God's wisdom.
Yeah.
God's wisdom is completely different than our wisdom. We do not
yeah.
even close and we don't even
Exactly.
understand His wisdom.
Exactly.
So how can we even ask the question, because we cannot even understand what God's wisdom is? I mean, you're saying God is smart because obviously he's by far smarter than we are.
Yeah.
But does that mean anything? Of course he's by far smarter than we are.
Really, what we're calling his wisdom here is not even of the same substance of our wisdom at all, right? It's really something else. Mm-hmm. It's some kind of divine expression, right?
You can call it as a la 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 la. It's the same.
You could. I agree. And to some extent you could. That's true. To some extent that's true. The reason why it's called Chachma is because it's the source of our Chachma, and not the source of
because
our
Chesed. It brings
Chesed.
about for us the same thing you talk about God's light. It's again, I mean, you know,
It's like saying, right? It's like if you change the valence. It's like saying that. The Alter Rebbe will give his own metaphor for this in chapter 10, which we'll discuss at great length. But it's like saying that the way we put it before is that his wisdom to us is ignorance, right? We don't know it, right? But what the Alter Rebbe is saying is that because it's an unknowable, right, that actually means to some extent it can be the source of our wisdom. It can be the source of what we do know, right? Think of it that way. There's three levels, right? There's our wisdom, which is what we do know. There's his wisdom, which is what we don't know. And there's him who's not within the realm of wisdom at all. Right? So the idea is that at that middle level, we can sort of meet, right? At the level of I don't know, right? The unknowable is a vessel for Hashem as he's completely beyond wisdom. If you understand what I'm saying. So in other words, there's a sort of meeting, there's a sort of, what did you say, interface? Is that what you said? There's a sort of meeting, there's an interface, there's a place where the two comes together, right?
Why
there's
his wisdom and our wisdom?
Him and us. Him and our wisdom, right? Where do they meet? They meet in where our wisdom, in what we don't know, right? In our ignorance. The Hashem as he is unknowable is a vessel for Hashem as he is beyond all knowledge, is essentially what we say. As we said, or as we put it last week, the Rambam's conception of Hashem is a vessel for the Maharal's conception, which is a different idea. But the bottom line is that you're right. His wisdom is not our wisdom. His wisdom, as we're describing it, is not knowable. That's the whole point. In essence, it is unknowable. It is absolutely one with him. However, it is still a step closer to us in a profound way than he himself is. It's closer to us knowing it than he is, in some sense. In some sense. In a very, very refined sense.
We talk about vision. So our vision and a snake vision.
Yeah.
So we both use the same term, vision.
Yeah.
Obviously, his vision is completely different than our vision.
Yeah, but it's still vision, though.
That's why they use chokhmah, because
it shares an essence, right?
I mean, it's like you understand.
But his chokhmah and our chokhmah doesn't even share an essence in that way. It's further removed than that. The only reason we call it chokhmah is because our chokhmah comes from there. It does in a way that it does not come from his chesed. right? Whereas the Alter Rebbe puts it in Torah the Alter Rebbe says the sweetness of the apple comes from chesed, and the bitterness of a bitter apple comes from gvura, right? That doesn't mean his kindness and his gvura are anything like sweetness and bitterness. It's the same mezeg in a very, very, very abstract way.
And the sun beam ray.
Yeah, it is like the sun and the ray of the sun, as we'll discuss more as we go into chapter 10. But so it's an extremely abstract form, right? The sweetness of the apple is chesed of Atzilus. Chesed of Atzilus is number one, infinitely removed in abstraction, and number two, the valence is switched. I don't know what the word is in Hebrew, but the valence, V-A-L-E-N-C-E, like positive to negative. No, not a veil. No, positive to negative is a change in valence. When you change something positive to negative, like the teichen is the wrong word. Erech, maybe, yeah. Something like that. So it's not just that it's an infinitely higher chachma, right? It's an anti-chachma. It's an ayin, right? It's not a yesh. That's the trick here. That's what's confusing everyone. Right?
So ayin times ayin means yesh?
What? It's not math. No, it's not math. The point is that our chachma comes from his chachma, but his chachma is infinite, first of all, and infinitely removed from ours. Erkiyut. His chachma is not just infinitely greater than our chachma, but it's a chachma of ayin, not a chachma of yesh. Right? It's a different. It's infinitely removed and the opposite. Right? Infinitely removed and the opposite. It's switched into nothing because it's only an expression of him, which is really what the Alter Rebbe is saying at the end of chapter 9. He's saying that his wisdom is wisdom, but what is it? It's an expression of him who is not wisdom. It's an ayin, not a yesh. Or as we put it last week, if you ask his wisdom, if you go and you look and you speak to Hashem's wisdom, Chachma v'Atzilus, right? Hashem's emanated wisdom, and you say, what is Hashem's wisdom? It would say there is no Hashem's wisdom, there's only Hashem, right? It's an ayin, it's a negative space. It's not a something, right? It's a nothing.
Him and his wisdom is one.
That's the point, right? It's a nothing in a way that it's totally in an achdus with Hashem, right? It tells you there is nothing other than Hashem. That's the message. The message of his wisdom is that his wisdom is nothing other than him, because he cannot be expressed in wisdom, right?
Simple.
Right? He's absolutely simple. He's absolutely one, right? That's what his chachma says. His emanated chachma says that he is absolutely one and he has no part in chachma. That's what his chachma says, right? That's what his chachma is. So he and his chachma are absolutely one. And the Alter Rebbe says that you cannot really understand this because it's a contradiction. On the one hand, it's a chachma. On the other hand, the entire teichen of the chachma is that the chachma doesn't exist and Hashem is absolutely one. Right? Hashem has no parts. His chachma is absolutely one with him. This is called Raza de Mehemnusa, the secret of faith, and you cannot understand it intellectually. It is known only through the emunah, only through the soul's
But the
grasp.
chokhmah is there.
Yeah.
But we cannot grasp it.
We can.
And the question is, how is our chokhmah related to that?
Well, our chachma is really a second issue that I was just bringing up because Eyal brought it up. The Alter Rebbe's main focus here, the thing that we cannot understand is the yichud of Hashem with his chachma. How are Hashem and his chachma absolutely one? That's what we cannot understand. Only on faith can we know this. Only on faith can we know this. That Hashem and his chachma are absolutely one, even though he has an emanated chachma. Right? That he is infinitely removed from. So even though he and his chachma are absolutely separate, he and his chachma are absolutely one. That's what you can't understand, obviously. Right? Obviously you can't understand it. That's what is known through faith. So we stepped back and we said the first 7 chapters are about Ein Eid, that there is nothing other than Hashem. These chapters are about how Hashem is absolutely simple, how his wisdom is absolutely one with him. And with this in mind, understanding the difference between these chapters and the previous chapters, we're now able to go into chapter 10, because as we're going to start seeing next week in Yirtzeh Hashem, the Alter Rebbe uses the exact same metaphor he used in chapter 3 in chapter 10. The Alter Rebbe is going to speak about the ray of the sun in the sun. But as we are going to see, the way the Alter Rebbe is speaking about this in chapter 10 is saying, in a way, the opposite of what he was saying in chapter 3. We are not discussing how everything is nothing. We are discussing how everything is an expression of Hashem, how everything is beyichud, everything is unified with Hashem and expresses Him. And we'll have more on all of this, God willing, next week.